Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome again to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for watching, and thanks to our producer, Jeff Durall. We're at Rary Call on the campus of Fort Hays State University, second floor, with Dr. Adam Holden, who is chair of the Department of Teacher Education at Fort Hays State University. We're talking with Dr. Holden about a survey that was done through the website Wallet Hub on 2014's best and worst states for teachers, part of which survey was done with Dr. Holden. And first, Dr. Holden, we have to get your background. Now at the Department of Education at Fort Hays State University, but a rather diverse background prior to that.
Right, I was born and raised in the United Kingdom, just south of London, and so I lived there. All of my schooling took place there, and qualified as a teacher and started my initial teaching and did some athletic directorship there. And then when I came here to the United States, I've worked predominantly as a principal and assistant superintendent in the eastern part of the state, although I took some time out down in Miami, Florida for 5 years, and now I've been back at the university here for a number of years.
The diversity of your background, was there a particular area along this line? Because you've been superintendent, you've been in the classroom, you've been at public and parochial schools. Was there a particular area that ventured you to the Department of Education at Fort Hays State?
Not necessarily. I had connections here, and I had taken my superintendent's certificates through Fort Hays, and really was impressed by the university. Find here at Fort Hays that the university blends the greatest of traditions with some really good innovation, as you know well, and that particularly appealed to me. I think in education, that's a challenge that we always face. How do we take the very best of what we're doing currently, but how do we also look forward to what's coming? How do we educate students for a world that is perhaps 10 years away and prepare them adequately? And
certainly there are traditions in education, but you have to move to new technologies and innovations as well then.
Absolutely, and you know, I would say this time perhaps more than usual. The technology itself has made a significant difference, and the rapid change of the technologies available to people really give us a different profile of a student. If you looked at the daily functioning of a student maybe 10 or 15 years ago and compare that to what students are doing today, it's really very different. And so, you know, teachers have a different set of challenges in the room.
Talk about your family. Anybody in teaching in the family?
Don't have family in teaching, ironically enough. My family still are in the United Kingdom. I have brothers and sisters and my mother and father, but none of them went into education.
Now, this Department of Education at Fort Hays State, talk a little about that, Dr. Holden.
I'm very fortunate to lead such a talented group of individuals. We've received some wonderful recognitions over the last few years, but on the NCTQ ratings, our secondary and elementary programs rank very highly, at 3rd and 12th in the nation. So we're very proud of that. I think we have a great set of students, and I think a really good balance to the university. Face-to-face students, a lot of our students come from Western Kansas, but also increasingly a lot of virtual students and international students.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing now that Fort Hays State is able to bring the same kind of expertise in the faculty to students in China or in another state, for example.
Right, and I think that brings with it great challenges for us as a faculty. If you know that you've got some students in China or students in Asia in your class, you need to do some reading up to find out a little bit about their education system, because they're going to bring that point of view and perspective to the class.
What draws students, do you think, to Fort Hays State, the Department of Education, to teaching specifically, Dr. Holden?
Well, I do think, you know, the university's call of really being the destiny of choice is one that makes a huge difference. I think that we put a lot of factors on the table within education that allow students to maximize both the quality of what it is they're learning with the practical circumstance that they find themselves in. For example, And some of our virtual students are people who are already paraprofessionals in the field and want to become a teacher. Working through our department, they can stay in schools. They can actually do a lot of their coursework with students face to face, get some wonderful experiences, and then qualify and be able to move into the classroom full time.
Let's talk a little about this Wallet Hub article. First of all, Wallet Hub, what kind of a company is it?
Didn't really know a lot about the company when they first reached out. It was a company that really put together, well, it looks like a series of rankings, but really it's informational pages for people to take a look at when making decisions. And so when I first spoke to them, they opened up the research that they were looking to do within education, and I thought that it was fairly balanced, and I thought that it would actually give some of our students a pretty good resource to go to and look at the information.
And they do a lot of rankings, don't they? Everything from the best and worst, which we're talking about, to first-time home buyers, things for recreation, living conditions, those kind of things. It really is a survey, a broad survey of social activity, isn't it?
It is, and I think for me the impressive element was that they'd reached out to experts in each of the areas that they were looking to. They'd gone and tried to find people from different parts of the country, from different states, to really give first-hand feedback, and that's really useful.
What kind of information did you provide for Wallet Hub?
Well, they asked some specific questions to guide our thoughts, but initially they wanted to know a little bit about some of the challenges facing educators. They didn't ask many state-specific questions. The criteria that they were using to look at that was based upon public data that they had pulled in. But then they wanted to blend that with some experience, I think, in the state, and somebody who had worked in a different capacity who could reflect upon whether or not the data really was reflective of the situation.
And that's really important, isn't it, that that data does reflect the actual world situation that these students are in?
Right, I think it is. I think data without any context is fairly limited. But when you can flush it out with the context, with real-life anecdote and experience, really makes it very powerful.
Well, of course, obviously, teaching is always in the forefront. It's something that most people experience, I think. And when you look over the survey itself, there were some interesting points that were made, if I may, from this Wallet Hub article. It says, no surprise, the high turnover rate within the field has been likened to a revolving door. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, about a fifth of all newly minted public school teachers leave their positions before the end of the first year. Almost half never last more than 5.
Right, and that's a really disturbing statistic for us in teacher preparation, because obviously we want to prepare students for a career in education. Those statistics are a little bit better here in Western Kansas in particular, but it's a challenge. The teaching arena is a highly complex one now, and teachers are being asked to do more and more and to really meet the needs, the individual needs of students. And when you have a group of 25 or 30 young individuals, that can be really difficult to do.
I think that's something that the general public, those who've never been in a classroom situation, cannot really understand. As you mentioned in your piece for the article, the greatest challenges teachers face, according to Dr. Holden, meeting the needs of all students. He gave an example of an educationally diverse classroom. Now, this is something that probably wasn't the norm 20 years ago.
Right, and I think that as society has evolved and as new technologies have come into the buildings, we see the ability for us to reach a variety of different types of student. But that puts an incredible stress upon the one person who's preparing all of those. Let's just look at an average example. If you were to take a class of 25 students, and an average class here in the state, you might have 2, 3, 5, 6 students who have been identified as having exceptional needs of some sort. Those can vary wildly. It could be students who are on the gifted end of need extensions and adaptations. It could be students who have some processing disorders or some behavioral disorders, which are a real challenge for the teacher. But then within the rest of the class, you might have a very wide range of students' natural ability. So if you're teaching a second grade class, you may well have some students in that class who are really functioning at a kindergarten or first grade level, and some who might be functioning at a 5th or a 6th grade level. Trying to plan one lesson, to meet the needs of all of those students and to make sure that each student gets just what they need. It's an extremely complex task.
And in addition to that, I think you're factoring in the background of these students. They may come from situations where they didn't have a breakfast to begin their day. They didn't have a weekend with a parenting situation.
Right.
You know, so many different variables that are involved that come into this classroom as one.
Absolutely. I've just literally walked in from a class of our students who are learning how to teach exceptional students, and we were talking about exactly that. How do you identify a student? It could be something very simple. For example, some of our districts in the state have a minimum radius that they won't bus within. So a student who lives 1.5 miles away from the school doesn't get busing. Well, on a day like today where it's 30 degrees outside and the student has to walk to school and maybe they didn't have breakfast, they're not starting ready to do math in a good frame of mind. It's a challenge. And more and more we're asking our teachers to connect with those students, to understand them, to really guide them beyond just the intellectual learning process, because as you well know, you have to connect with the student before they'll learn from you.
And in addition to that, Dr. Holden, then you have to factor in the increasing numbers of those students that appear in the classroom because of budgetary restraints.
Right, and that's a big challenge. As numbers increase, it may not seem a lot, but if you add 4 or 5 or 6 students to a classroom, if that adds another 4 or 5 different needs to the classroom, you've just expanded the work amount for that teacher significantly.
And you've diminished the chances. I love that statement you made about you have to connect with the student before you can teach them. And that's a fantastic statement. Teachers must be able to multitask in order to complete the seemingly endless pile of critical paperwork and required testing. I think one of the biggest things maybe that drives these potential teachers out.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting because I think that when we get to see our students go through a wonderful transformation here, when, as with anything, as you might imagine, when a student first signs to come into teacher education, they have a fairly idealistic understanding of what might be taking place. They may have some friends or family who have been involved in education. But as they spend more time in classroom and as they work with our professors who do really an outstanding job of equipping them to understand the challenges they'll face, we begin to see, even before they've graduated here, the weight of some of those, some of the paperwork, as I would call it. And I think there's a broad range of that. First of all, just the grading intensity is significant. I mean, at the elementary level, we're asking our teachers to go in and be a specialist in the teaching of reading, of writing, of mathematics, of social studies, of science. That's a lot to cover. And there's a lot of work done in those classrooms and a lot of writing done, and the teacher has to spend a tremendous amount of time grading and giving feedback to those students. And as part of that connective tissue, you can't take an assignment in and spend 3 weeks grading it because you've disconnected with the student. Our students live in a world where they expect almost immediate feedback, and so do their parents, and that's understandable, but it's an added pressure for the teacher. And then I think the other point you touched upon, which has really framed the educational debate in recent years, has been the testing. There's a significant amount of testing now that takes place in our schools, whether that's statewide testing, whether it's national standardized testing, or whether it's just the basic diagnostic tests that a teacher might do to see how their students are progressing in the class. But you've got elementary teachers who will regularly be required to do monthly testing in the reading and the writing and the mathematics. On top of that, they'll take standardized tests, state assessments. Those come pretty thick and fast, and it may be that you've got some form of assessment every 3 to 4 weeks.
Now, as a professional educator, are these testings valuable? Do they provide the necessary input? I know teachers get the input from grading the papers, but is this a valuable way to spend a teacher's time?
Well, that's a great question, and if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be sitting in another office.
You would be running for an office someplace.
I would, right. Look, I think as in any profession, data is critical. You know, if I'm expected to prepare future classes, I need to know where my kids are. I need to know what they have learned and what they have yet to learn. And so some form of data collection and then planning based upon that data, I think, is absolutely critical. I think that argument wanes a little bit when we start talking about how we might look at broader testing. In other words, it would be nice to think that that we could reduce the amount of testing that we do and use the data that we collect in a more complete or comprehensive manner. I do think that we need to find out how well our students are. I think it's critical if we're going to close the achievement gaps, if we're going to really meet the needs of the groups of students who haven't necessarily been well served in education, that we find a way to demonstrate that. That has to be balanced with the complexity of what we're asking our teachers to do and how often we're asking them to do it.
And really the teacher is the first line of defense, if you will, on that feedback and input of what that student learns and has yet to learn.
Well, that's the irony. The irony is that we're collecting the data and using the data for national and international comparisons. The expert in the field is the teacher in the classroom. They know their students better than anybody else. They're the ones who need the data. I know we like to, districts are required to put data up and to show it to other people. But the reality of why we need to collect it is to give additional information to the professional who knows their students better than any. We come back to what we were talking about earlier. They're the only person who understands the context. And we talked earlier about having data out of context. It doesn't necessarily give you the accurate picture. If you really want to find out how well a kid is doing, the first place, really probably the only place to go, is that teacher.
And that's really why those parent-teacher conferences are so valuable
Critical.
for parents.
Absolutely.
You mentioned too, let me ask you this question and get your response. How can local officials make their state more attractive to the best teachers?
And that's becoming a really interesting dilemma for us. And I think that not just within, as a state, but within areas of the state. We're seeing districts here, for the first time I've been contacted by districts who are struggling to fill teaching positions who traditionally never have been. And that's an alarming trend, because we do know that the attrition rate is so high. My own personal opinion, that has a lot to do with burnout, has a lot to do with how we're stretching our professional educators. And teachers go into the field primarily because they want to help kids, because they want to do well. It's almost a professional service calling. And when that person's motivation is diminished significantly, when they don't feel they're helping their kids the way they should do, they're going to naturally leave. Ironically enough, I think there's always a basic standard of living issue. We look at the most successful nations in the world in terms of their teaching, and Finland has led the way for many years. There's a direct correlation between what teachers are paid and how they're respected in society, in my opinion, and why they have so many good teachers who want to go into the profession there. I think we can learn from that. But then secondly, most teachers don't go into the profession to get rich. They go into the profession to make a difference. I think the best way that we keep them in the profession is to help them make a difference and make sure that they know that they matter and that we care about their efforts.
You made two excellent points that I'd like to reemphasize if we could. That is the status of teachers throughout the world, much higher, I think, than in the United States. Unfortunately, we're seeing a reversal of that, where teachers are denigrated as opposed to being elevated.
You know, it was perhaps the biggest shock to me when I came to the United States. To be a teacher is a noble profession in the United Kingdom, and some of the schools that I worked in, I was extraordinarily proud to have been placed in, and very proud to have got a job there and to have worked in the establishment. When I came to the United States, it was interesting for me to see how societal norms were different. And perhaps the lack of respect that teachers see on a daily basis from all forms of society is something that in the long run, if we want to fix it, we're going to have to change.
And that, of course, plays into the situation of some real efforts nationwide, I think, in this country, to destroy the basis of teacher value. And part of that, you figure in unions, where they have no voice without them.
You know, it's going to be an interesting few months here coming up. It's going to be an interesting session in terms of our lawmakers, and we'll know more about the direction, you know, in a few months. But I think you're right. I think that as somebody who was an administrator and often sat on the other side of the table from teachers' unions when we had conversations, the administrators I talk to do not want to see them go away, and I don't think that we would value a lesser voice from the teachers. There always needs to be discussion about, you know, what type of voice it should be, and I think collaborative unions between the teachers and the administrators in any district is far better than confrontational ones. But I do think that the overall trend of how teachers feel, how they're seen, how they're treated, is going to have to change a little bit if we're going to want to overcome the statistics you talked about today.
And of course, one of the big issues that Kansas is dealing with are budgetary issues, and those play directly into the classroom and into the support that teachers get.
I hear that as I travel across the state, and I'm fortunate to work with a number of school districts across the state. It's what we hear more than anything else is, you know, it's ironic. Teachers would give up a salary raise, many of them, for more resources because they really are in it to help the kids. When those resources are cut, when those critical paraprofessionals in the classroom who are trying to help them, or teachers' aides, when students and teachers can't get some of the digital technology or some of the text that they need, it makes their job far, far harder. And so it's a nervous time for us, and we'll see how we move forward.
When teachers, regardless of what level it may be, have to take money out of their own pockets to fund school supplies that they're using on a daily basis, that really sends a strong negative message, it seems to me.
Well, I think it does, and I think it's, you know, we often compare trades, but I can't imagine a surgeon going out and providing, you know, the materials they need for surgery. I just can't imagine that it would happen, or an attorney, you know, having to fund some of the things that happen in a courtroom. It just wouldn't happen. But again, it comes back to that calling. It comes back to teachers wanting to do what's well for kids.
And much of the time, people in the teaching profession have come there because they have experienced a good teacher in their past at some point.
Yeah, always. You know, it's interesting. Just about anybody. Whether I was watching recently the build-up to the Super Bowl, and they were talking to some of the football players, and each one of them had a story about somebody who had impacted their life. So many of them were teachers and coaches. And I think all of us, whatever profession, can go back to a time where somebody in the teaching profession helped us or changed our lives.
Okay, the suspense is over now. It's time for us to reveal the 2014 best and worst states for teachers. We'll let you take the lead on that, Dr. Holden,
well,
if you would, please.
Well, we'll do. Interestingly enough, the best teaching states, Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Massachusetts, which is an interesting mix of across the country for a variety of reasons. At the other end, unfortunately, Kentucky, Tennessee, Colorado, and Oklahoma. So a difference across the board. Kansas came in at 16th, which is reasonably good, reasonably strong. I think it's a fairly fair reflection when we look at what was compared. And just so people know what was looked at a variety of different things. They looked at a number of teachers per capita. They looked at a teacher-pupil ratio. They looked at student spending at different levels. They looked obviously at some of the scores. They looked at population density, teacher salaries, standard of living. So it was a pretty thorough review, and I thought that the experts that they asked to come in and talk were varied and from across the country, and gave some reasonable feedback.
You had college representatives, you had small colleges, you had a little bit larger areas that were referenced there. But it's interesting that so many of those measurements that you made there were the very things you talked about. Budgetary issues, the number of students in a classroom, those type of things really make an impact on the outcomes of the students as well as the longevity of those teachers.
I think it does. I think it's the same in many organizations. The working conditions, the resources you have, the time you have. And then the other thing that I think is specific to teaching is how you feel about what you do. When you go into a profession because you want to help people, if you stop feeling like you can, you know, people often think it's time for a change.
We have website that you can see the complete article on. It's at wallethub.com, and the best and worst states for teachers for 2014. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. Dr. Adam Holden, Chair of the Department of Teacher Education at Fort Hays State University, our community connection. Thanks for watching.